Hello. As Ukrainians endure temperatures of -20 and even lower, Russia is striking power and heating plants. Is Moscow simply turning the screws on the civilian population? Does that make it a war crime? Or is there a legitimate military logic to it? Mike and Simon will tackle those questions, while Colin Freeman tells us firsthand just how hard winter is biting in Ukraine. Also on Sitrep, as the last nuclear weapons control treaty between the US and Russia expires, is this the start of a new arms race or just paperwork catching up with reality? And military personnel are to get new powers to shoot down drones in the UK after a doubling of incidents near bases. But is that really the answer?
I'm still not convinced as a society we want to allow bullets or rounds which can ultimately hit objects or people far away.
The big question is whether the US and the Russians are going to go back to the insane 10,000, 20,000 level of nuclear weapons that they had during the Cold War.
Defense Explained.
Temperatures here are about -25 degrees centigrade. When blocks of houses get power cut off, it is a pretty immediate matter of life and death.
The Russians have always regarded civilians as intrinsically part of the battle. They don't make this distinction.
This is Sitrep with Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
War is always a brutal thing, Mike, but when nature is also acting as a deadly enemy, it's hard to imagine this as anything but the most brutal it has been for many Ukrainians since Russia's all-out invasion.
Yes, it's often said that war is something, when the Russians go into it, they find that the weather is their secret weapon. It happened in the Napoleon invasion of Russia in 1812. It happened when the Germans invaded in 1941. It's happening again now, more briefly. And of course, this is not an invasion of Russia. This is a Russian invasion of another country. But here you are, weather is helping them in their war. They kind of regard it as their right to make the best of bad weather. And it's very tough for the Ukrainians. This is far and away the worst winter of the four that they've had since the all-out invasion began. But there is a sort of a sense of optimism, it seems, in Ukraine, that they will get through it, and that we're in early February now, and that they can see the prospect of the end of it, at least of the cold.
And this is a very particular combination. Not only is it the coldest, hardest winter in Ukraine for a decade, the head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Danielle Bell, has told BFBS Forces News there has been a distinct shift since October in the level of attacks against energy and heating infrastructure. BFBS reporter Simon Newton is with us once again. Hello, Simon. You've been looking at the data. Give us an idea of the scale of attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. What and how much has been hit?
I was actually speaking to somebody in Kyiv yesterday about the situation where they are and how bad it is. I think there's different figures, but the figure that we're hearing is something between about 1,100, even up to 4,000 apartment buildings are now without power in just in Kyiv alone. And obviously, that's buildings, not individual apartments. And that situation is mirrored in places like Kharkiv, in Odessa. I think I looked at the temperature in Kharkiv, was -17 last night. As Mike said, they've done this before in the winters of 22, 23. But during those periods, the electricity and the power systems remained functional. They lost some generation, but they didn't have this energy deficit, which is what they're now facing. And they're saying they can now supply only around 60% of the electricity needed in Ukraine because they've got 4 years of accumulated damage that they're having to try and repair as they're being hit with these huge waves of Shahed drones and missiles. And so the Russians seem to really, their aim is just to sort of finish it off completely and try and cause a complete energy collapse in Ukraine. And whereas before they were using Shaheds and missiles, they're now using ballistic missiles like Iskanders to hit these things. So I think I read somewhere that there's not a single power plant in Ukraine that they haven't managed to hit. And there was a report yesterday I saw in the Kyiv Post, I think, that they were going to ration electricity in Kyiv, possibly this month, down to 4 to 6 hours a day. And this is causing a huge exodus of people also from Kyiv, millions actually leaving the city to go and try and live with parents, etc., or whatever in the countryside. So it's having a really devastating effect.
Yeah, and you mentioned Kharkiv. We'll be getting the picture from the ground there in a moment. But Mike, what pattern do you see? Is this a case of Russia moving focus onto this infrastructure, or is it a combination of more attacks overall with effects then amplified by the brutal winter?
Oh, it's certainly that, I think. It's a combination of things. But undoubtedly, the Russians have focused on energy this winter, and they've done this very deliberately, much more than in any other year. And they've taken advantage of the technical problems which Ukraine has, because it's this, first of all, it's a Soviet system built in the Soviet era. And so the Russians know where everything is. And they know that they're not just taking out the generation plants, but the substations and so on. That's first point. Second point is because it's Soviet era stuff, then certain plants actually serve enormous numbers of apartments. In the West, we're more decentralized. The heating unit for big apartments is in the bottom of the apartment. But the heating units for ranges of apartments, whole regions, whole areas of a city are single big power plants and then the substations. So by hitting that main focus, you can bring complete closure to many, many more people because of the way it was centralized. And then thirdly, because of that, it is also the case that when the electricity goes off, the pipes have to be drained in all the big apartment blocks, because in this sort of weather, pipes that are full will freeze and then they'll crack, and then you won't get the heating on again. And so it causes an even bigger disruptive effect. So the Russians know all of this, and they've strategized on this to give Ukraine as miserable a winter as possible. They could not have guessed, I think, that it would become so cold this winter. That's just good luck from their point of view. But there you are. They've strategized for it, and the weather is helping them, at least for the time being.
But Mike, can you actually see any legitimate case then for heating plants as a military target? Because if not, a deliberate attack on those plants would be a war crime, wouldn't it?
Yes, I mean, anything that attacks civilians directly because they're civilians is a war crime. The case you would have to make that this is a military target is that somehow there is a direct connection between the civilian well-being and the ability of the troops on the front to fight. And, I mean, that's the sort of connection that people made in the Second World War with area bombing, that the Allies were bombing areas of cities because that's all they could reliably hit. And they said that if we actually create the social conditions in Germany for an uprising against Hitler, then it'll bring the war to a swifter conclusion. That's a pretty hard case to make. And if the Allies had ever had to justify it in front of a tribunal, which they never did because tribunals didn't exist in those days, that would have been a tough case to make. The Russians would have an even tougher case to make here, that actually just trying to inflict misery on the citizens of Ukraine to make them give up, to make them push their government to give up as a way of preventing what is happening on the front lines. That's a very, very stretched sort of logic.
So, Simon, to the point that Mike was saying, so if you had to prove that was a war crime, you'd have to make some link between the impact on the civilians and the military capacity of Ukraine. What are you hearing about the morale of civilians in Kyiv at the moment?
Of civilians in Kyiv.
Yep.
Well, I think we've got the Abu Dhabi talks going on, etc., which they don't seem to hold much hope for. I think Mike shares that view that they're probably doomed to failure of some sort. But in terms of their morale, I think they are holding out. And I guess they're just looking for a break in the weather at some point, which I think is probably going to be in March. I think that's traditionally when the temperatures start to rise slightly. So it's a question of hanging on.
Yeah. What about those who are fighting?
I've been in these trenches with them. That they can actually, the Ukrainians are very good at making their trenches and their ops rooms, etc., warm. They've got wood fires in them, and they do manage to survive. In terms of their morale, I mean, cold weather, winter weather is renowned for sapping morale and making it much more difficult just to soldier effectively. So it's obviously having an effect on the military capability of both sides. But I think, again, if you were to look at morale on either side, I would think the Ukrainians is probably better.
Mm-hmm. We'll analyse the targeting and strategy a bit more in a moment, but let's hear from Ukraine itself and get a first-hand snapshot of what's going on there. Journalist Colin Freeman is there once again, and I spoke to him late on Tuesday from Kharkiv. It's
really cold up here. It's even colder than Kiev. The temperatures here are about minus 25 degrees centigrade. So it's the coldest I've ever been anywhere. And you're at that point where all the roads are encased in ice. You have to keep your car running all the time, even when you park it somewhere for a certain amount of time. Otherwise, you get problems with it starting. Mobile phone batteries die quite quickly, all that kind of thing. So it really is, the conditions here are about as difficult as they come. Certainly, that's the coldest winter Ukraine has seen, I think, since the war began.
Yes, and attacks on the energy infrastructure are not new in this war, but where you are right now, is the effect more extreme than you've seen before?
Well, there's certainly been attacks on infrastructure here. The Russians seem to be trying to knock out all the energy infrastructure here. I think the people in Kharkiv have been fairly resilient so far at getting things repaired, but the cold here really is, it's a menace, it's a killer. I mean, when the bus door opened on my way up here, for any more than a couple of minutes, and you're really starting to feel quite uncomfortable. And it's the kind of temperature that you can't survive out in for any length of time. So when blocks of houses get their power cut off, it is a pretty immediate matter of life and death. I mean, just in my hotel room overnight, the power was off. I think due to some sort of strike at some point during the middle of the night, not anywhere near where I was. And when I woke up, the room was freezing cold. Luckily, the power came back on at 8 o'clock. But if it hadn't done, I've been out all day today, coming back to a freezing cold room. It really gets pretty unsustainable quite quickly. And, I'm here as a visitor.
And how are people who live there coping?
Well, surprisingly, morale seems okay. I've not heard anybody actively complaining. I think quite a lot of people have left in the last few months, but more generally, a lot of people stay partly just because they've got nowhere else to go. And the city authorities here are very quick to try and do their best to patch up any problems. I went to the scene of a drone strike this afternoon, a drone that slammed into a block of flats, and 3 people were injured, 3 people were rescued by some miracle. It wasn't more serious than that. And as well as the emergency services being on the scene very quickly, you get groups of rescuers and volunteers turning up, dishing out hot soup and coffee and providing a bus for people to go and take shelter. And so there's a very streamlined volunteer side to things that make sure that when these incidents happen, people are not just left to fend for themselves in the cold. Yeah.
And how bad was the damage caused by that strike?
Well, if you looked at the block of flats, it hit, I think, the second floor of the upper second floor of, I think, about an 8-story block. And you would have thought there'd be, half a dozen or a dozen or more people killed. In this case, I think there were 3 injured and 3 not seriously injured, and 3 others dug out of the wreckage by the firefighters. Every time I see something like that, you think, I'm amazed that the casualty count isn't far higher by a factor of 10. But these attacks have been happening more or less on a daily basis since the start of January. So the people, sadly, are kind of used to them. It's relatively unusual to have one in the middle of the day, but that does sometimes happen.
So you say attacks on a daily basis. How does that compare to when you were last there?
When I was here in Kharkiv, I think I was last here in about spring of 2024, they were still shelling the place there, firing drones at the place then. I understand there's been a bit of an uptick, mainly to try and concentrate on the energy facilities, to try and take them out at this point when really the energy facilities are vital to people's survival. But I mean, it's been a constant factor here for really the last sort of, more or less the duration of the war. The Russians have never stopped trying to hit the place one way or the other.
And how far are you now from the front lines, the fighting zone?
Well, we drove up to the north side of town this afternoon to a place called Saltivka, which being the side of town nearest the Russian border, I think is about 25 or 30 miles to the Russian border from there or so. And I was told that the nearest Russian positions from where we were about maybe 15 miles or so. So we're not that far out, no. I think we're just about out of artillery range, but certainly not out of drone range, unfortunately. So you have these Iranian-made Shahed drones, such as the one we saw this afternoon that ploughed into the block of flats.
And can you get any sense from there of how it has been for the troops fighting on the front?
We spoke to a few who were at a petrol station, who were just about to head back to duty. One of them had just taken a break for a fortnight, but he's spent the previous 20 days when he was on duty, 20 days in a foxhole in conditions of, minus 15, minus 20 degrees centigrade, with not much more than a campfire, like a portable camping gas stove to warm his hands on occasionally. I really couldn't figure out how on earth he manages to cope with something like that. It sounded absolutely hideous. And he also had to walk, I think, about 20 kilometres to get to his position. Because of the drone threat, you can't travel in or out by car anymore. And that also accounts for the fact that explains also why he had to be there for 20 days solid, was because the drone threat, when you're outside of the trenches, outside of cover, is so great that they want to minimise the movements to and from. Sounds really, really, really tough. Yeah, he was about to go back in. He didn't seem too bothered about it. He said, it's all part of duty and this is what we do.
And does it feel different to last time you were in Ukraine?
I think there's a bit of a sense of where is this going? There doesn't really seem to be any immediate end in sight at the moment. The Ukrainians are no longer have a sense of victory really around the corner. They just feel like they're holding the Russians at bay. On the other hand, the Russians don't seem to be likely to make any serious breakthrough any time soon. As one soldier this afternoon put it, really the only thing that's going to change the status quo here, to break the deadlock either way, would be an atom bomb. Which I think obviously a rather dramatic way of putting it, but sums it up rather bluntly in some ways.
So you're saying to me that these are about the worst conditions. Is it true to say these are about the worst conditions you've had to report in?
In terms of the cold, this has been the coldest winter since the war began, as I understand it. And this is certainly about the coldest I've ever seen it, when it's sort of minus 20, minus 25. It gets difficult to sort of really physically do anything. Your hands will get frostbite if you expose them for more than about 5 or 10 minutes. Your hands are sort of starting to get really cold. Do that for half an hour and you're going to get yourself into trouble. So it's really, 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 tough just to really be outside. Humankind, I don't think, is really invented for being out in conditions like this unassisted.
And I guess, Colin, we've been lucky to have you for this length without an interruption in the electricity or the line. Just wondering, could you just give us an image of how you're going to spend your evening?
I think, well, believe it or not, there are still restaurants and bars open in Kharkiv. So I've actually got some work to do. I'm not going to go out gallivanting, but there are places to eat. So restaurants and bars, how do they manage? They all have generators these days, and that's another sound you hear. You hear the sound of generators going off a lot, which is reminiscent for a lot of your viewers of what life was like in Iraq back in the days of the invasion, and how all the power supplies went down there. Only this time that was to keep people cool. This is to sort of keep people warm.
Colin, all the best. I really appreciate you giving us this update. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So what Colin describes there, really brutal conditions, but Russian troops are also experiencing them. They don't get a free pass on the weather, do they, Mike?
No, they don't. And what's interesting is that the Russians have made no offensive progress at all now for a couple of weeks. They've lost ground in Kupiansk, quite a lot of ground, over December and January, and they've ground to a halt. So the front lines are pretty static at the moment. There's still fighting going on in them, but they're making no progress whatsoever. So the weather has slowed them down quite a lot. And because it's been so cold, it's also been fairly clear, which in this case helps the defenders because the drones can see them more easily. So, the Russians are less able to cope because they're less well trained than the Ukrainians. They're less able to cope with the freeze, and the freeze is not good for their offensive intentions. So things have ground to a halt on the battle lines.
And how long has this really, really deep freeze been going on, Mike?
Well, I keep an eye on Ukrainian weather, as you do, and it looks as if it's going to be cold again for the first part of next week. Then it lessens a little bit towards the middle to end of next week. And after that, it's not so bad. It may be that they're past the worst of it, or they will be by this time next week. And as Simon said, what they're waiting for is the Rasputitsa. which is the mud season, as it's called, the Rasputitsa, which very predictably begins in early or later sort of second week of March. So if they can get themselves through another 4 weeks, then the Rasputitsa will help, because that's the wet season and temperatures will rise quite a lot.
And Simon, from the sources you monitor, how has this freeze affected the frontline fight itself?
Well, I mean, to Mike's point, it's different in lots of different places. It's almost hard to generalize about what's going on. I think that from what you can see, the battlefield is sparser. There's less going on, and this kill zone that we often talk about, which is obviously saturated with drones from both sides, that seems to have got wider. There's obviously much less mechanized movement than we've seen in the past. We talked previously about challengers getting stuck in the mud and stuff. We're not seeing any of this stuff going on. But despite the fact there's still fighting going on, serious fighting in lots of places. But for the Russians, it really just it's a really miserable affair. I mean, they seem to be faring worse than the Ukrainians in terms of just dealing with this cold weather. They're being sent forward in these small infiltration groups now. That's the sort of tactic. They don't have enough to sustain them in that fight. They're crossing open ground. They can't dig in. And so unless they find some shelter, which is what a lot of them are doing, apparently, they're trying to basically find some shelter and just stay there. Then either the weather or a Ukrainian drone is going to get them. So the Ukrainians have these kind of well-prepared, deeply dug in positions. And so the Russian casualties, we saw that figure in December of 35,000 claimed by the Ukrainians Russian soldiers killed just by drone attacks. But the Russians continue, obviously, to have this manpower advantage. They're flowing these people forward into these basically suicidal attacks in lots of places. So there is fighting in Kramatorsk. There's this fighting going on in Zaporizhia. They're only about 10 miles from Zaporizhia city. They took about 80 square miles or so in January of territory. But even at the glacial sort of pace that they're moving, they are still putting certain places under threat.
And Simon, I'm guessing the data is not easily available, but one thought I did have when I was talking to Colin, when he talked about mobile phone batteries not working, I guess that could badly affect drones too.
Yeah, well, the biggest problem for drones is this cold weather. It can cut the battery life in half. The motors take on moisture, apparently, and that can freeze, which basically makes them unflyable. I've been looking at videos, they're using de-icing sprays on their drones to try and keep them. They're even apparently rubbing meat fat on the propellers of some of these drones to actually try and stop them freezing over, to insulate them. The logistics of everything just becomes much more difficult. To get the petrol they need for their generators is much more difficult. To obviously power those packs you're talking about, the hydraulics in their vehicles, etc., freeze. And artillery, for instance, I was reading, I'm not a ballistic expert, but artillery is affected badly by the cold. The actual ballistic trajectory of shells is lessened because the air is thicker. Cold air is thicker than warm air, so they don't go as far as they would have done before, and the propellant in the shells burns more slowly, so that has this effect on the actual weaponry. And that's even just touching bare metal with your hands, etc. All those sorts of things that just make soldiering in this sort of environment so much more difficult and so morale sapping for these men. And we have also seen, I have to say, videos of Ukrainian soldiers being brought back from the front line, casevaced, with frostbite. It is a dreadful situation.
Simon, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, it's more than half a century since the US and Russia first signed a treaty aimed at capping numbers of nuclear weapons rather than having an ever-inflating race. But as of this week, that era is over. The last such bilateral treaty between Moscow and Washington, New START, has just expired. Mike, what was New START? What protections and safety barriers have just disappeared?
Well, New START was the latest iteration of the old SALT process, Strategic Arms Limitation talks. And the first treaty on SALT goes back to the late 60s, but the first treaty was 1972. And then there was another one, SALT II, in 1979. And then it was updated in 1991 with START, so Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And then Barack Obama in 2010 negotiated with Russia a New START, which went to 2020, and then it was rolled over in 2021 for 5 years to 2026. And so essentially the whole process of SALT and then START is to put a cap on the number of ballistic missiles that each side, Russia and America, could target at each other, And importantly, it had a series of verification issues in it. So there was inspections and notification requirements and so on. And so it all came down to that phrase that Ronald Reagan popularized, trust but verify. You know, we trust you, but we're also going to verify. So trust but verify was the basis of the idea of this limitation on the ballistic missiles that each side would target against the other. And as such, it was a big treaty, and it was a kind of cornerstone of a lot of other arms control deals. When SALT and START was in place, then other things all seemed to be much more possible. And that's what's disappeared as of this morning.
Well, let's bring in William Alberk, former director of NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament and WMD Non-Proliferation Centre. He's also served as treaty manager at the US Department of Defence. William, great to have you back on Sitrep. Did you have a hand in the creation of New START, and how are you feeling about its end?
No, I didn't have a hand at that. I was working at the Pentagon on conventional arms control at the time. So as Michael was talking about, that whole scaffolding of agreements that came out, starting with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and negotiations between 1962 and 1970, the SALT process. I was on the conventional arms control and working also on intermediate nuclear forces, the other agreements that were part of this whole thing. But I was watching the negotiations very carefully, and really good friends of mine, Rose Gadamuller and Mike Albertson, were big parts of that. And it was a very complex process. They worked very, very hard to get inspections in place. Michael mentioned that. The need to verify these agreements was really, really important. And that's all gone as of midnight last night.
And how are you feeling about the end of New START?
It's very sad. I mean, to be fair, this was a process that was born out of the Cold War and the idea that the US and the Soviets were the biggest deals. They were the problem. They were the issue. And if you could get the two sides to work together, then perhaps you could get rid of all of nuclear weapons. It was a little bit naive. You know, it was kind of pretending that India and China just sort of didn't exist, or were just going to go along if the US and the Soviets got rid of their nuclear weapons. And today we see China really building up their nuclear forces. We see North Korea. We see India and Pakistan. The idea that a US-Russia treaty somehow solves all of that is a little naive. It was an important part of security, but it wasn't the cure-all. And I think we're just seeing the hangover, the crash from this Cold War idea into this new world, which is much more complicated, which is, I think, why the Trump administration, for instance, insists that a future arms control treaty would have to involve China.
Yeah, William, sad, but how worrying, particularly when you say it was a bit naive.
Well, it was naive to think that the US and Soviet concordia would somehow eliminate conflict forever. And really, this was part of the idea behind the United Nations effort on general and complete disarmament, that once you solved this implacable conflict between capitalism and communism, global peace would break out. It was naive. But there are important tools that are still in place between the US and Russia, some of which were negotiated during this period. You have the 1972 Agreement on Avoidance of Hazardous Incidents, which reduces the risks of navies and air forces having accidents that go to war. You have an agreement on the prevention of nuclear accidents between the US and the Russians, which requires the two to keep each other informed about ballistic missile launches. You have the 1988 Agreement on ballistic missiles, which requires the two sides to notify anytime they launch a sub-launch ballistic missile or an ICBM. You have the Prevention of Nuclear War Agreement from 1973. So there are still risk reduction mechanisms between the two countries that I think help. And these agreements also have offshoots. The Russians have similar agreements with other countries, including Russia-China agreements. There are agreements between the United States and China. So all is not lost, but I think we're recognizing that these agreements have to go beyond just the US and Russia, that we need more global guardrails on nuclear risk.
And when he was in post as Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin warned this risks the unravelling of the architecture and frameworks that have kept us safe for decades. Mike, did New START have any direct effect for the UK? Does anything in our thinking or posture change as a result of this?
No, we were always keen to keep our nuclear weapons out of the negotiations, because the Russians always said, oh, well, if we're dealing with, American weapons, well, what about French and British weapons? They should be part of the deal. And of course, we didn't want our weapons to be counted in those limitations, because we had very small forces and we didn't want them to be limited by treaty because of some other, bigger deal between Washington and Moscow. So we were very keen to keep them out of them. And also, when we started talking about tactical nuclear weapons, we wanted to keep them out of that as well. They said, well, they're not really strategic weapons, they're ours. And when they started about tactical weapons, well, they're not really tactical either. So we always made a special case for our own weapons because they're minimum, and they are at a pretty minimum now. But the thing that matters now with the collapse of New START, or the lack of follow-on, is that nuclear politics have become more relevant now than they have been for 50 or 60 years. And that's one of the things that is very disappointing, that for years, nuclear politics were always there, the threat was always there, but it was of low salience. You didn't have to worry about it too much because the structure was essentially stable. And what we've seen now is that nuclear weapons, the possession of nuclear weapons, now looks more important to most countries than ever before. And the Russians never cease to remind us that they have nuclear weapons and any crisis could quickly go nuclear. They are using their nuclear weapons to try to frighten everyone. So it increases the salience of nuclear weapons, which you could say means that British nuclear weapons are even more important than they were before, because they're not now just a weapon of last resort. They're an important reassurance that we don't have to allow ourselves to be bullied by an aggressive Russia that keeps making nuclear threats.
And William, does this change the nuclear threat to the UK, or is this not about those kind of weapons?
Honestly, I think the lack of an arms control limitation between the US and Russia has limited impact on the United Kingdom in the short term. Now, if the US and the Russians start to really, really build up their forces, and we're talking about devoting hundreds of billions of dollars to building thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. You have to remember, in the Cold War, there was a peak of around 65,000 nuclear weapons between the US and the Soviets. If the US and Russia are going to go down that path, that means they're going to be devoting huge amounts of resources to nuclear weapons. And as Michael pointed out, if you've got that many weapons, you're going to think about using them all the time. So we might have a second order effect on the UK, but at least in the short to medium term, this doesn't really change the threat. Again, as Michael pointed out, Russia is using nuclear threats all the time, even when the treaty was in place. They're trying to coerce outcomes. They're trying to back the UK off, for instance, from supporting Ukraine with nuclear weapons, with nuclear threats. For Russia, the UK has always held some really strange place in their mythology. They're really, really concerned about, UK plots and UK conspiracies and things like that. But again, in the short term, Russia has been willing to use nuclear threats while this treaty was in place. They're going to continue to use such threats. The big question is whether the US and the Russians are going to go back to the insane 10,000, 20,000 level of nuclear weapons that they had during the Cold War.
And William, the INF Treaty, which limited Russia's ability to strike Europe effectively, collapsed in 2019, 5 years ago. What has happened since then? Has Russia stocked up on those intermediate range weapons since then?
Yes, they absolutely have. And that does have a much more significant direct effect on the UK. Because, for instance, Russia has this missile called the Oreshnik. It's a medium-range missile. It was designed to strike targets in Europe and the UK, basically to try to prevent the US and the UK from reinforcing Europe in case of war between Russia and NATO. And Russia has built many, many systems, both while the INF Treaty was in place. That's why the INF Treaty went away, was because Russia was violating it. And then afterwards, they've been building lots and lots of systems. And now NATO and the UK is having to think about what kinds of missiles they need in order to hold Russian targets at risk. So now you see the UK and Sweden and France and other European countries working together to try to develop their own medium-range missiles to be able to deter Russia from being able to threaten the UK and to be able to attack NATO.
And Mike, what happens now? A new arms race?
Well, yes, I think there's an arms race ongoing now in intermediate systems for the reasons that William has just talked about. The two central deterrents between the United States and Russia probably won't change in the short term. But if there is a prospect of a new treaty coming into force, let's say not for a while, but in 4 or 5 years' time, there'll be a push to create more weapons before the treaty comes into force, so that you start a new limitation treaty with more than you have now. And the point is that's a game that the Americans will lose, because the Russians can build weapons a lot faster than the Americans if it comes to it. So I think we are in for a new arms race, a new nuclear arms race. Most of it will be in the intermediate and tactical level. That's already started. And I think after a pause, when the United States realizes what a mistake it's made and starts to scramble to get some sort of treaty, then there'll be another push on the strategic weapon arms race, the ICBMs, between the two sides, which the Russians will win, at least in numerical terms.
And Mike, how will the UK act in that race?
Well, same as before. We will maintain our minimum nuclear deterrent, so we will maintain the continuous at-sea deterrent, which from our point of view is adequate. It's not as big as the others, of course, but it is adequate to do astonishing damage to an aggressor, and by this we mean Russia. The bigger question for Britain is whether we make good on going in with tactical nuclear weapons, with a squadron of F-35s, which are nuclear capable. And there's arguments for and against doing that, but I think that will be the direction of our nuclear thinking. So we'll carry on with our submarine-based deterrent as is for the next 50-odd years, and we probably will get deeper into the tactical nuclear game, which is very sad to say. I mean, we thought we were getting out of all of this in the 1970s, and here we are going back into it.
William, as far as New START is concerned, technically it's been suspended from Russia's end since the full-scale Ukraine invasion. So are we actually at a point where both sides realise they have more than enough warheads and know how to use a high-security phone without needing it written down?
Well, the U.S. and the Russians both devote a lot of intelligence resources to monitoring each other's nuclear infrastructure and force posture. So you could say that, we're watching this anyway. Did we really need arms control? The fact is that on-site inspections give you so much more confidence that you know exactly what's happening, that you can see with your eyes what's going on, rather than only relying on spycraft. So I do think we lose a degree of confidence that we know what's really going on. Now, for the Russians, they have a very high degree of confidence that they know what's happening. You see, anytime the UK Parliament has a debate about changing force posture, lifting the warhead limit, anything like that, that is really, really telegraphed. And the same thing in the United States. If the US is going to change the number of warheads they have, that's going to go through a congressional process. It's going to be budgeted. So I think Russia feels like they have a really long lead time on knowing what's going to happen. We in the West, however, lose a degree of confidence because Russia is more secretive. And even though, again, we have high confidence in our intelligence capabilities, we are losing a degree of transparency, a degree of confidence, which is going to put internal pressure on us to think, do we have enough? At the same time, with China building up, we're really concerned. Do we have to have as many nuclear weapons as Russia plus China? Now, Britain doesn't take that point of view. As Michael said, minimum credible deterrence, enough weapons to cause damage. I do think you're going to get back into the tactical nuclear weapons debate, because if we can't rely on the US for extended deterrence, the UK may come under more pressure to provide more options to the Allies in terms of nuclear deterrence. There's a big debate going on right now coming out of the strategic review as to what the future of the UK's nuclear deterrent needs to look like. But it's a very uncertain time. That's the whole point. The lack of New START is a different era. As Michael had said, we've had 54 years of bilateral nuclear arms control. Leaving that era is scary and uncertain, and that's where we're seeing anxiety right now.
And Mike, we do have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed by nearly 200 countries. Why do we need anything to add to that?
Well, because the NPT is very general, and it doesn't address the particular competition between powers that have already got nuclear weapons. So the NPT is about more states who may go nuclear, not those states who are nuclear, increasing their forces. So what we're talking about here with the START process is the increase in forces for those states who already deploy them. That's the shame is that we've lost the restrictions on that. But the NPT has been, in a way, reasonably successful in restricting the number of nuclear players in the world. There are 9 nuclear countries in the world, 9 nuclear players. We used to think, 20 or 30 years ago, we thought there'd be well over 20 by now, and there haven't been. So the NPT has been reasonably successful, even though it's a very hypocritical piece of work. The original 5 nuclear weapon states said, well, we'll keep ours and we'll agree not to give them to anyone else, but nobody else can have them except under, very, very strict conditions of civil power monitored by the IAEA. The Global South regards it as very discriminatory, which it is, but for all of that, it has had quite a strong restraining effect, I think, on the horizontal spread of nuclear weapons.
You're nodding away through that, William. What would you like to see going forward?
Well, the only addition I would have is the Non-Proliferation Treaty Article 6 has a very general exhortation that those 5 nuclear states enshrined within the treaty must work towards nuclear arms control. It was always very vague. It's very hard to nail down. And those 5 countries have always said, as long as we're talking to each other, we're fulfilling that requirement. So I would like to see The P5, so the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia, the 5 original nuclear weapon states of the NPT, continue talks on how they can reduce risks of nuclear war. And I would like to see them also reach out to India and Pakistan more and try to work together to figure out what to do with North Korea. The problem, of course, is Russia 2 years ago signed a new treaty with North Korea to defend them with an Article 5 NATO-type guarantee, which gravely complicates the denuclearization of North Korea. We see this real fracture among the UN Security Council, those 5 powers who are also the nuclear powers. I would like to see them have more serious conversations, but I think the problem is that while the US, the UK, and France have some interest in reducing risks, Russia and China really don't. The more China builds up, the more that concerns India. The more India builds up, the more that concerns Pakistan. North Korea, as I mentioned, it's on its own crazy course. So I do really fear that we're going to see, unlike in the Cold War, the US-Soviet race, which was one thing, now we're seeing a much more multipolar nuclear system, which has higher risk of collateral conflicts that could draw the major powers in. I think we're just entering a much more dangerous period. And I would like to see all these countries take that more seriously, but instead I do think they're fracturing and we're going to see more disputes and more nuclear threats coming up.
William L. Burke, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you for joining us again on Sitrep.
Thank you.
Okay, from the biggest beasts of military hardware to some of the smallest, drones, and some worrying numbers revealed this week. Drone incidents near UK military bases have doubled in the past year. 266 of them were recorded in 2025. The government also announced it will give new powers for the forces to take action against drones both in the air and water. Mike, I think some people were surprised to learn that in this context, military personnel currently don't have the legal authority to shoot down drones and have to rely on the police.
Yes, that's right. It's a very important principle of British democracy and society that only the police are allowed to be armed on British streets. And so that's why, if you see the soldiers in Horse Guards parade or outside the palace or whatever with their SA-80 rifles, they don't have any ammunition. I mean, they have their bayonets, of course, but they don't carry ammunition. They're not allowed to have loaded weapons. But they're always armed police lurking around somewhere near where the soldiers are. And that's an important principle. And what it means is that if you were to go onto a military base, then you could be confronted with armed guards. I mean, the Gurkhas or whoever's on guard duty. I mean, they have loaded weapons because that's a military base. But the air above a base is civilian, and the area around a base is civilian. So it's police only. That's the present situation, and obviously that's got to be reviewed a little bit in the case of drones to give the military, I think, the power to shoot down or do something with drones. Certainly if they're over bases, but even if they're near bases now, I think we've got to change that.
And those numbers of drones near bases have doubled in a year, yet it's not clear why nor who is flying these drones. The government says with some of the incidents, we can't rule out hostile state actors. Not exactly reassuring.
No, I mean, and some of the drones, if we look at the European cases as well as the ones we know of in the UK, some of these drone sightings are clearly being handled by professionals, people who know what they're doing and they seem to have a strategic idea in mind in some cases. And I think, we have to say that those are agents of a foreign power. But equally, we know that our adversaries, particularly the Iranians and the Russians in particular, are encouraging groups, private groups, kids, troublemakers, to just have fun and buzz around with their drones in sensitive areas. So they're inspiring people as a matter of sheer mischief to get involved. And that will be a different issue. And I think we may need to look again at the law and the penalties for flying drones in sensitive areas to try to make it clear that this is a serious offence. If you get convicted of this, if you're some young kid, it won't be 20 hours of community service. It will be a serious offence. And indeed, if people are hanging around military bases with malign intent, then they may end up running quite big personal risks as the law changes.
And is it clear to you what the new powers are that the forces will get?
No, not so far, other than there's a general agreement, I think, in the MOD and in number 10, that they've got to look at this quite quickly. So I would expect there to be an ability for the forces to take on drones in airspace, within a certain area of a military base, and maybe to give them more powers of arrest, on the fringes of a base, if not to carry weapons outside a base. I would expect that sort of thing, but I'm only guessing. We don't really know yet.
You mentioned other cases around Europe. It's not just an us problem. Has anyone actually got a handle on defeating this kind of problem?
Not in legal terms yet, but in technological terms, all of the European partners, all of our partners in NATO are looking quite carefully now at different sorts of drone technologies. And some of them are really very promising. I do think that this may be an issue which will be less serious in 3 or 4 years' time, because I think there are technological answers through ways of defeating drones, certainly low-flying drones and drones that are mischief drones. You can swat those away like flies in a way. But the more serious drone intrusions, I think, there will be technological fixes for that, which may involve lasers, different sorts of electronic devices, and also ability simply to shoot these things down in a kinetic way. So I suspect, I'm guessing, of course, but that in 2 or 3 years, this problem may seem less difficult than it does at the moment, but it will cost money and commitment and both changes in the law and bringing forward a number of new technologies.
And of course, one difficulty, Mike, is a very practical one. The issue that shooting down these drones risks collateral damage, including people.
Yes, it does. And that's one of the things that I think that we've got to take on board, that if a drone is shot down somewhere near a military base and it lands in a civilian area and lands on somebody's roof or whatever, it's going to do some damage and it might cause injury. And we mustn't be deterred by that prospect from doing something that needs to be done from the point of view of national security. But it is an attendant factor for sure.
There is, of course, this EU plan for a drone wall stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, possibly as soon as 2027. Is it the case that it's possible to protect ourselves, but countering new threats is always going to be a step or two behind?
Yes, and that's the world in which we're in now, that we're reacting to threats that are growing fairly quickly, and all of our reactions are, in a way, multi-layered. So you create one layer, and then you're going to have to put another layer behind it. We mustn't get into too defensive a mindset, and so there's always a balance to be struck between what is affordable and what is a calculated risk. But undoubtedly, we're living in an era where we have to now consider not just deterrence as our defense, but defense in a series of layers. And one of those layers clearly is a drone wall in Europe and a version of drone wall for installations in the United Kingdom.
Mike, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our guests. We'll have another Sitrep for you next Thursday. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.